This is Criminal Interrupted. Now, before we begin, I want to address the time of the year. For those of you listening in the United States, today is Thanksgiving, or yesterday was Thanksgiving. Here in Australia, we don't celebrate that holiday, but to all my listeners across the pond, I hope you have a safe and happy Thanksgiving with your loved ones. It's a day typically associated with family, gratitude, and coming together. But tragically, for one particular family in Jupiter, Florida, a Thanksgiving gathered back in 2009 turned into an absolute nightmare. Paul Michael Merhige, a man invited to share in the holiday meal, instead unleashed unimaginable violence. By the end of the night, 4 family members were dead, including his 6-year-old cousin, Makayla, and his pregnant sister, Lisa. This is a difficult and detailed topic to cover, and your support is what allows me to continue bringing you these in-depth episodes on complex cases. As I've mentioned before, I'm currently focusing on this podcast full-time due to a heart condition, so every follow and review makes a huge difference. Please take a moment to follow or subscribe to Criminal Interrupted on your favourite podcast app. Liking this episode and leaving a review is the best way to help others find me. Thank you for listening and for your incredible support. To understand the events of Thanksgiving 2009, we must look into the past and complicated family dynamics surrounding Paul Michael Merhige. Paul Michael Merhige was born in 1974 to Michael and Carol Merhige in South Florida. His parents were described as devoted and traditional. Michael worked in real estate and business ventures, while Carol dedicated herself to raising their children. Their family was seen by neighbours as comfortable, close-knit, and deeply rooted in faith and appearances. Paul grew up alongside his siblings, his twin sisters, Carla and Lisa, and their older brother, John. Carla and Lisa were bright, social, and accomplished. By their early 30s, they were thriving. Lisa was married to Patrick Knight and was expecting her first child, while Carla was building her own independent life. They were considered the pride of the family, educated and well-loved. Paul's older brother, John, was remembered as protective, part of the strong family unit that Paul himself once praised in his high school yearbook, writing that he felt blessed to have twin sisters and a brother watching over him. Together, the Merhige children represented a family that valued education, tradition, and success. From the outside, the Merhiges looked like the kind of family everyone wanted to be a part of. Parents who supported their children, siblings who were close, and an extended network of relatives who gathered often for holidays and milestones. But beneath that image, tensions and struggles were building, especially between Paul and the rest of the family, setting the stage for the tragedy that would unfold years later. The Merhige family story of violence did not begin with Paul. Decades earlier, tragedy had already struck from within. On his father's side, Paul's aunt, Salwa Merhige Abrams, committed one of Miami's most shocking family murders in July of 1973. Salwa was a gifted mezzo-soprano, once celebrated for her opera performances. She had given up her career to raise her family, devoting herself to her husband, James Abrams, a commercial pilot, and their 2 children, Jack and Melissa Ann. But after 19 years of marriage, James left her for a flight attendant. The divorce was finalized that summer, and Salwa's world collapsed. Friends later said she was consumed by grief and humiliation, unable to accept the betrayal. Shortly after the final hearing, Salwa invited James to the family's Miami home under the pretense of talking things over. What he didn't know was that she had already bundled their children, 14-year-old Jack, 10-year-old Melissa Ann, and the family dog into her car. Inside the house, she confronted James in the master bedroom. With a .38 caliber revolver, she shot him 4 times in the chest, killing him instantly. Then, in a chilling sequence, she called Jack inside and emptied the revolver into his body. Melissa Ann was led into another room where she too was shot and killed. After murdering her family, Salwa swallowed a handful of barbiturates in an attempt to take her own life. She lingered in a coma for 5 days before dying at South Miami Hospital. The case stunned the community. Neighbors who had known the Mirage family called them cultured and refined. One retired Miami police officer, Lloyd Hugh, later recalled them as, quote, super nice, end quote. He struggled to reconcile the brutality with the family's reputation. Hugh, who investigated the murders, remembered the moment he realized the connection years later. Quote, it's the same family, end quote, linking the 1973 killings to the Merhige name that would resurface decades later in Paul's massacre. Now we'll go back to Paul's early life. Paul attended private Catholic and preparatory schools, reportedly including Gulliver's Preparatory Academy, one of Miami's most elite institutions. By all outward measures, he was the golden boy. Friends remembered him as quiet but intelligent, a solid athlete, and a strong student. He led it in football as a varsity kicker, and teachers recalled him as mature, polite, and articulate. In his senior yearbook, Paul wrote a message to, quote, all 32 members of my family, end quote. He said, quote, I love you now and will forever. I have been so lucky to be blessed with twin sisters and a protective older brother, end quote. Classmates later told the Palm Beach Post he was the kind of kid every parent wanted their child to be around. The Merhige's social circle extended beyond their household. Carol's side of the family, the Josephs, were just as close. Her brother, Dr. Antoine Joseph, and his wife, Raymond, had 2 daughters, including Marielle. Marielle later married television cameraman Jim Sitton, becoming Marielle Sitton. Together, they had a little girl named Makayla, Carol's great-niece and Paul's cousin once removed. Family gatherings were frequent and warm, with the Merhige, Joseph, and Sitton families moving between homes. The cousins grew up together like one extended household. But beneath the surface, Paul showed troubling signs even before high school. At 13, during what relatives later described as a heated family argument, he reportedly produced a loaded handgun and pointed it at family members. He didn't fire and police were never called, but the incident lingered. Through high school, Paul's life seemed to balance between control and chaos. He remained a top student and athlete, yet those closest to him noticed changes. Withdrawal, obsessive habits, and sudden bursts of anger he couldn't explain. By his late teens, according to family testimony and medical records, he suffered what his mother called a nervous breakdown. Doctors diagnosed him with major depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder. He cycled through therapists, psychiatrists, and medications, sometimes improving, only to slip back into isolation and obsession. Friends described strange rituals, multiple daily showers, obsessive shaving, refusing to wear shorts, laying several pairs of underwear, and becoming paralyzed over the smallest decisions. He gained weight, lost hair, grew self-conscious, and began talking about suicide. At times, he hinted at dark fantasies involving his family. Paul briefly enrolled at the University of Miami, though reports differ on whether he dropped out before completing a semester. What's clear is that his instability deepened. He returned home, where tensions with his parents worsened. Michael and Carol continued to support him financially, paying rent, covering bills, and arranging medical treatments. But their patience was wearing thin. Paul's life had shifted from promising golden boy to a young man consumed by illness, obsession, and growing resentment. By the late 1990s, Paul's life had diverged sharply from that of his twin sisters, Carla and Lisa. They were thriving, educated, social, newly married, and starting families of their own. Paul was not. In 1998, tensions exploded when Carla filed a restraining order, alleging that Paul had threatened to slit her throat and then kill himself. Paul countered with his own complaint, accusing her of threatening him. Both orders were dropped within weeks, but their distrust never healed. As one family told the Miami Herald, quote, "They were terrified of him, and they still kept trying to save him," end quote. Over the next decade, Paul's world shrank into bitterness and dependence. He lived alone but remained financially tethered to his parents, refusing steady work or continued treatment. He complained that his family had ruined his life, even as he relied on them for survival. By the early 2000s, his siblings and parents began keeping their distance. Family gatherings went on without him. He was no longer invited to birthdays, holidays, or weddings. His brother-in-law, Patrick Knight, later told police that Paul had become, quote, "a fat, lazy failure, stewing in self-pity," end quote. By the fall of 2009, Paul was 35 years old, living alone in a modest Miami condo paid by his parents. He wasn't working, wasn't in therapy, and had cut off nearly all contact. Over the years, his parents had tried everything: paying bills, covering insurance, arranging medical care, enrolling him in programs, even considering involuntary commitment. Nothing lasted. Still, the Merhiges hoped that time might heal him. Even Marielle and Jim Sitton, who hadn't seen Paul in more than a decade, remembered him fondly as the cousin who had once shared every holiday meal. That Thanksgiving, November 26, 2009, the Sittons hosted dinner at their home in Jupiter, Florida, about 50 miles north of Miami. Their gated subdivision, Jupiter Parks Homes, was quiet and upscale. Around the table were Marielle's parents, Dr. Antoine and Raymond Joseph, her aunt and uncle, Michael and Carol Merhige, and the Merhige twins, Lisa Knight and Carla Merhige, both 33. Lisa, 7 months pregnant, had driven up with her husband Patrick. Carla arrived separately. At the center of it all was Jim and Marielle's 6-year-old daughter, Makayla. That afternoon, she had strung homemade, thankful cards across the living room and later performed a snippet from The Nutcracker for her family. She was rehearsing for her recital the very next day. There was only one guest no one expected: Paul. The Sittons hadn't seen him in over 13 years, and they hadn't invited him. In the days leading up to Thanksgiving, Paul had called his parents repeatedly, asking what time dinner would start, who would be there, and whether it would be just family. His tone was polite but strangely insistent. Carol confided to Lisa that she had a bad feeling. Lisa told her mother not to say it out loud, but admitted she feared the same thing. Patrick Knight later recalled Lisa saying, quote, "I hope he doesn't come and kill us all tonight," end quote. Despite their unease, the family went ahead. They wanted a peaceful dinner, hoping Paul might finally feel included. He arrived late, around 8:30 p.m., polite but distant. He didn't eat. He didn't join in when Makayla played piano. He sat quietly on the edge of the room, hands in his pockets. No one knew that in the weeks before, Paul had purchased multiple firearms and thousands of dollars in ammunition, spending over $2,000 at Miami Gun Shots on a Remington 700 rifle and several handguns. He told clerks he planned to go hunting. He also withdrew $12,000 in cash and packed clothes and supplies in his car, preparing to disappear. As the night wound down, Paul excused himself, but instead of leaving, he retrieved his weapons. Just after 10 p.m., with dessert and coffee finished, and family members scattered between the kitchen and living room, Paul re-entered the house. Without a word, he raised his gun and opened fire. His first shot struck his twin sisters, Lisa and Carla, killing them instantly. Lisa's husband Patrick was hit in the stomach but survived. Paul then turned his rifle on his aunt, 76-year-old Ramon Joseph. The first bullet hit her shoulder. As Dr. Joseph rushed to her side, Paul reloaded and fired again, killing her. Witnesses recalled him turning to his father, Michael, and saying chillingly, quote, "I've been waiting 20 years to do this," end quote. When the main floor fell silent, Paul walked down the hallway to the room where 6-year-old Makayla was asleep. She'd only met him for the first time that evening. He stood over her and shot 3 times. Her parents tried desperately to reach her window, but it was too late. She was gone. When it was over, Paul walked out calmly, got into his 2007 blue Toyota Camry and drove away. At 10:04 p.m., a neighbour called 911 reporting gunfire. By 10:10, police units had arrived, but Paul was already gone. Inside the Sitton home, detectives found what one later described as a scene of frozen contradiction. Thanksgiving decorations still hung on the walls, dishes of food sat untouched on the counter, and the thankful cards that 6-year-old Makayla had strung across the living room were still in place. And yet, 4 family members were dead: Lisa Knight, Carla Merhige, Ramon Joseph, and little Makayla Sitton. 2 others were wounded but survived. By midnight, the home was sealed off with yellow tape, the driveway crowded with patrol cars, floodlights, and news crews. Reporters from WPTV, the station where Jim Sitton worked as a cameraman, were among the first to arrive. Colleagues who had known Jim for years were now covering the murder of his daughter. Investigators from Jupiter Police, Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI launched a full-scale manhunt. Within hours, Paul's photos were released, described as armed, dangerous, and mentally unstable. Tips poured in across Florida. That night, a local pastor came to sit with Jim and Muriel Sitton, who refused to leave the house. Jim later said he couldn't bear to let police take Makayla's body away, and sat beside her bed holding her hand until the coroner arrived. Detectives quickly pieced together evidence of premeditation. Surveillance footage showed Paul buying a rifle scope and ammunition in the days before Thanksgiving. He had withdrawn $12,000 in cash and filled his car with supplies: toiletries, clothes, extra license plates, duct tape, rope, even a car cover. He left his phone behind, forcing investigators to rely on sightings of his 2007 blue Toyota Camry. For weeks, he vanished. The first major break came thanks to America's Most Wanted. Jim Sitton appeared alongside host John Walsh, pleading for help to catch the man who had killed his daughter. The episode offered a $100,000 reward, and in Long Key, Florida, the owners of the Edgewater Lodge recognized their quiet guest in room 14. He had checked in under the name John Backer, paid cash, rarely left his room, and kept a blue Camry hidden under a tarp with swapped license plates. So they called the US Marshals. On January 2nd, 2010, federal agents surrounded the motel, evacuated guests, and cut off escape routes. Inside, Paul had barricaded the door with a mattress and a metal rod. He tried to run for the bathroom but was quickly subdued. Investigators found 2 handguns, 5 cell phones, a laptop open to news coverage of the manhunt, and in the closet, a noose made from nylon cord, helium tanks, a plastic hood, and a book titled Final Exit: The Practicalities of Self-Deliverance and Assisted Suicide. As he was let out in handcuffs, Paul muttered, quote, 18 years I've been tormented. I didn't even know what I was doing, end quote. He spoke of mental illness and called the killings a nightmare, a mix of self-pity and detachment. Back in Palm Beach County, prosecutors charged him with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder. Within weeks, the state attorney announced they would seek the death penalty, citing the calculated nature of the killings. Paul pleaded not guilty. His defense pointed to his long history of psychiatric hospitalizations, suicide attempts, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Prosecutors countered that his meticulous preparation proved competence and intent. The case dragged on for nearly 2 years. Jim and Muriel Sitton, still living in the same Jupiter home, spoke often about the emotional toll of waiting for justice. They kept Makayla's room untouched. By October 2011, prosecutors faced a difficult choice. To secure the death penalty, they needed to prove aggravating circumstances beyond mental illness. After months of evaluation, they offered a plea deal. If Paul pleaded guilty to all charges, he would receive 7 consecutive life sentences without parole, sparing the family from reliving the murders in open court. Paul accepted, acknowledging his medications but insisting he was lucid. He offered no apology. The decision devastated the Sittons. Jim brought a lock of Makayla's hair into the courtroom and pleaded with the judge to reject the deal, saying, quote, "If there's anyone who deserves the death penalty, it's someone who would execute my 6-year-old daughter while she slept in her bed," end quote. Judge Joseph Marks, himself a survivor of gun violence, accepted the plea. Paul was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms in the Florida Department of Corrections, where he remains today. For the Sittons, there was no satisfaction. Muriel later said justice wasn't about punishment, but about ensuring something like this never happens again. In the aftermath of the massacre, Jim and Muriel Sitton, grieving the loss of their 6-year-old daughter Makayla, filed a civil lawsuit against Paul's parents on September 15, 2010. Their argument was simple but heartbreaking. Michael and Carol Merhige had supported Paul financially for years, knew of his violent history, and could have prevented the murders by refusing to enable him. In 2014, the 4th District Court of Appeal ruled that Merhige's parents could not be held liable for the massacre. The Sittons transformed their grief into purpose, founding the Makayla Joyce Sitton Foundation to support music and dance programs for children, keeping alive the memory of their daughter who loved to perform. The Jupiter home still stands, and the Sittons live there with their 2 daughters born after the tragedy. Each Thanksgiving, they hang Makayla's thankful cards again, a ritual of remembrance in a house that is both sanctuary and scar. In interviews, Jim and Muriel spoke openly about their faith and their decision to remain in the Jupiter home where the murders occurred. Friends and neighbours often asked why they didn't leave. Their answer was rooted in memory, quote, "This is our home. If we leave, we lose all the memories of when Makayla was alive," end quote. For Patrick Knight, Lisa Merhige's husband, he spent 3 months in a coma and had to relearn basic functions. Walking, swallowing, and even sleeping alone. His recovery was long and painful, but he eventually reclaimed his independence. Whilst hospitalised, Patrick initially believed his pregnant wife Lisa had survived. A priest visiting his room let slip the truth, that Lisa had been killed, which Patrick described as the most devastating moment of his recovery. Patrick later gave speeches about his survival, describing the physical and emotional toll of recovery. He spoke openly about his grief, saying he carried Lisa and their unborn child with him every day. He emphasized faith and resilience, turning his survival into a testimony of endurance. In 2011, Patrick sued Paul's parents, Michael and Carol Merhige, claiming they knew Paul was dangerous and failed to protect Lisa and the rest of the family. The case was part of the broader legal aftermath with the Sitton parents, though courts ultimately ruled the parents could not be held liable. When the legal proceedings ended, Paul Michael Merhige faded from the headlines, yet the question his case raised never truly disappeared. How does someone with every structural advantage, education, resources, a family that never stopped trying to help him, descend into such violence? Psychologists who studied the case pointed to what they call chronic grievance syndrome. It's a form of obsessive rumination in which perceived slights and failures accumulate over years until revenge begins to feel like the only option. In Paul's case, decades of resentment and untreated illness culminated in a single night of devastation. Today, Merhige remains incarcerated in the Florida Department of Corrections, serving 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He's been described as withdrawn and largely invisible since his conviction, with no significant updates reported from inside prison. His name surfaces only in retrospectives of the case, reminders of a Thanksgiving that turned into tragedy, and of the enduring questions about family, mental illness, and the limits of prevention. Thank you for listening.